The Master of Prayer. Once there was a master of prayer, who always devoted himself to prayer, songs, and praises to God. He dwelled outside of civilization, but he often entered into it. He would engage someone in discussion, typically people of low standing, such as destitute people and the like. He would speak to them heart to heart about the purpose of life. He would say that the only true purpose is to serve God. All the days of one's life, to spend one's days praying to the Lord and in songs and praises. He would expound him with words of arousal until they made an impression upon the person, until he wanted to join him. As soon as the person showed readiness to join him, he would seize him and spirit him away to his camp located outside civilization. The Master of Prayer had chosen a place outside civilization. In that place a river flowed, and there were also fruit trees. They would eat the fruits, and he was not strict about clothing at all. He was accustomed to enter into civilization all the time, to persuade and draw people into the service of God, to go in his way and be involved only in prayer, etc. All those who were attracted to him, he would take them away to his place outside the civilization. They would be involved there only with prayers, songs, and praises to God, and confessions, fasts, mortifications, repentance, and the like. He would give them his books of prayer, songs, praises, and the like. They would be involved with this all the time, until some of these people were able to draw others to serve God. Then he would give permission to enter into civilization, to do the work mentioned above, that is, to draw people to God, as described above. The Master of Prayer was involved with this all the time. He would continually attract people and take them outside of civilization until it made an impression on the world, and his work became well known. Suddenly, people would disappear, and no one knew their whereabouts. Suddenly, someone would lose a son, and they would not know where he was. Eventually, it became known that it was due to the prayer leader, who tempting people to serve God. Yet it was not possible to recognize or catch him, for the prayer leader acted cleverly and would change and transform himself with each individual with whom he spoke. With one person, he would appear as poor men, and with another as businessmen, and with another identity, and so on. Also, when he spoke with people and saw that he could not influence them, he would mislead them until they did not perceive his good aim, as if his intention was not at all to draw people to God. It was not at all possible to perceive that this was his intention, whereas in truth this was the only reason he spoke to people, to draw them to God. His entire intention was only this. However, when he saw that he was not able to influence someone, he would entangle him, confuse him, and deceive him until the person could not all understand his good intention. The prayer leader was constantly involved in this work until it made an impression in the world. They desired to catch him, but it was not possible. The prayer leader and his people lived outside of civilization and were involved only with these things: prayer, songs, and praises to God, and confessions, fasts, mortifications, and repentance, etc. Also, the prayer leader had an ability to give every individual what he specifically needed. If he understood that one of his people, according to his level in serving God, needed to be dressed in clothing of gold, he would give it to him. And the opposite. Sometimes a rich man would join with him, and he would take him out of civilization, and he would see that this person needs to go about in torn and ragged clothing, and he would have him go accordingly. He would provide each one according to his need. For these people whom he drew close to God, a fast or mortification was more precious than all the delights in the world. Now, there was a country that was very wealthy. Everybody there was well to do. However, their behavior was very strange and bizarre. Everything was determined by a person's wealth. Each one's value as a person was according to his wealth. One who had so many thousands or millions had one status, while someone with different amount had a different status, and so on. The entire hierarchy was based on the wealth of each individual. One who had the amount of thousands or millions determined by them would be king. Also, someone with a certain amount of money would have a corresponding flag, and a status according to his flag. Someone with a different amount of money would have a different flag, and he would have the status matching that flag, corresponding to how much money he had. They had it standardized how much money a person needed to have in order to be given a certain flag, and the status that went with it. The status of each person was determined by his wealth, according to the standards they had set. They had standards specifying that if one had such and such an amount of money, he was a man. If he had less than this, he was an animal or a bird or the like. There were among them wild animals and birds. For example, a man with only such and such wealth would be called a human lion. Similarly, with the other varieties of animals and birds, according to the person's financial situation. He would be considered only an animal or a bird. The priority for them was money, and the level and standing of each person was determined only by money. Stories circulated in the world about this country, and the master of prayer who would sigh about this and say, "Who knows how far they can fall into error through this way?" There were people with the master of prayer who did not ask his advice and went on their own to this country to bring the people back in repentance. They had great mercy on them, seeing that they had fallen so far in their lust for money, especially since the master of prayer said that they could potentially fall much further. Therefore, they went to these people in that country, hoping maybe they could bring them back to the path of good. Upon coming there, they began speaking with one of them, assumedly some animal, that is, a person of low stature, for he was poor and had been labeled as an animal. They began to talk to him in their usual fashion, saying that this was not the real purpose at all, and that the real purpose was only serving God, etc. He did not listen to them at all, for it was already rooted in their minds that the main point was only money. They tried talking to someone else, and he also did not listen. One of the master of prayer's followers persisted in talking to him, and he responded, "I do not have any more time to talk to you." He asked him why, and he said, "Because we are all now preparing to leave the country and go to another. We have come to see that the main purpose is only money. Therefore, we have agreed to go to a country where a lot of money can be made. There is much dust there that can be made into gold and silver. Therefore, we all need to go to that country." The people of this country also agreed that they wanted to have stars and angels as well. That is, when a person gathered enough money according to the standards they set, he would become a star. Since he had so much money, he had the power of that star, for the stars cause the gold to grow. This dust that is made into gold, it is due to the star that makes gold grow in dust-ridden places. Thus, the gold is drawn out of the stars, and if a person has a great deal of gold, it must be that he has the power of that star, so he himself is a star. Thus, they also said that there would be constellations and angels among them, such that when a person acquired enough money according to their standards, he would become a constellation or an angel. Then they concluded that there should also be gods. One who had thousands and millions according to their standards would be a god, for if the gods were granting him so much money, he himself must be one. they established this system as described. They also decided that it did not befit them to dwell in this coarse world, and that it was not in accord with their honor to have contact with common human beings, so that they should not become impure, for considered other people of the world defiled compared with them. So they searched out the highest mountains in the world in which to dwell, so that they should be elevated above the air of this world. They sent out people to search for such mountains, and they went and found mountains that were extremely high. All the citizens of the country then went to live there. On each mountain, a gathering of them settled. Around the mountains, they built strong fortifications and deep moats, so that it was impossible for anyone to approach them. They would leave only one hidden path ascending each mountain, so that an outsider could not penetrate. Further, they posted guards around each mountain, so that no one could come near. They dwelled on these mountains and lived according to the customs described above. They had many gods, all according to wealth. However, since the main thing for them was wealth, and through wealth many of them became gods, there was a threat of murder and robbery. Each one was ready to murder and rob in order to amass more money and become a god. However, they reckoned that since the wealthy became gods, they would be able to protect themselves from these crimes. They also established services that would be prayed and sacrifices to be offered to these gods. They would even sacrifice people, and sometimes themselves, in order to merge with their gods, and then be reincarnated as wealthy people. Their entire faith was based on money. They had services, sacrifices, and incense with which they served their gods. That is, the wealthy people who had gained this stature. Nevertheless, the country was filled with murder and robbery, for those who did not believe in their religion murdered and robbed freely in order to amass money, for the main thing for them was money. With money, it is possible to buy everything: food, clothing, etc. And a person's main life force is money. In their confused thinking, they believed this. Thus, money was their faith. They would see to it that they never lacked money, for money was their primary faith and spirituality. They were always attempting to add and bring more money into the country from other places. They sent out merchants to other countries in order to make profits for their country. According to their outlook, charity was certainly forbidden. One who gave charity diminished the bounty that the God had given him, since the key point was that a person have money, and one who gave it away made a blemish in his money and lessened it. Therefore, it was clearly forbidden for them to give charity. They also had supervisors who were assigned to oversee if each one really had as much money as he claimed. Everyone had to display his wealth regularly in order to remain on the same level. Sometimes an animal would become a man, or a man an animal. That is, when one lost his money, he would fall from man to animal, or when one gained more money, he could rise from animal to man. The same applied to the other levels that were determined by wealth. They had portraits of those gods, wealthy people, and everyone had a copy of the portraits. They would hug and kiss them as part of their service and their faith. The righteous people of the Master of Prayer returned and told him about the great error and nonsense of that country, how they were very tangled in the lust for money, that they were preparing to leave their homeland and to make stars and angels out of themselves. The Master of Prayer answered that he was afraid they would go deeper and deeper into error. Then he heard that they had made gods out of themselves. He said that this was what he had been worried about from the start. The Master of Prayer had great mercy on them, and he decided to go there himself. Perhaps he could return them from their folly. He went there and approached the guards posted around the mountain. The guards, it could be assumed, were people of low rank, because they were allowed to stand in the atmosphere of the lower world. The wealthy ones, who had a high standing because of their money, could not mingle at all with the people of this world, nor stand in the atmosphere of this world, lest they be contaminated. They could not speak at all with the people of this world, lest they defile them through their words. Thus, it was clear that the guards who stood at the foot of the mountain were of low rank. However, even the guards had the portraits, and they would hug and kiss them all the time. Even with them, the main faith was based on money. The Master of Prayer approached one guard and began speaking with him about the purpose, that the main point is only serving God, Torah, prayer, and good deeds, etc., and that money is nonsense and not the purpose at all. But the guard did not listen to him at all, for they had already sunken for a long time in their belief that the purpose was money. He went to a second guard and also said this to him, and he also did not listen to him. Thus he went to all the guards, and none of them listened. Then the Master of Prayer decided to enter the city on the mountaintop. When the people saw him, it was a wonder to them, and they asked, "How did you get in?" It was not possible for anyone to enter. He answered them, being that I have already entered, what does it matter how I did it? He answered, he started to speak with someone about the purpose, and he did not listen at all. And so the second, and so all of them. They had already become immersed in their error. It was a wonder to them that someone would come to them and say such things that totally contradicted their faith. They thought to themselves, perhaps this is the master of prayer. They had already heard that there was such a master of prayer in the world, for the affair had already become publicized in the world. They would call him pious, the pious master of prayer. However, they were not able to recognize or catch him, for he would change himself with each different person. With one, he would appear a businessman, with another, a pauper. He would invariably slip away. Invariably slip away. Meanwhile, there was a warrior, and several other strong men gathered around him. He went with his followers, conquering cities. He wanted only their submission. So when the people of the country would submit themselves to him, he would leave them alone. If not, he would destroy them. He went all over and conquered. He did not want money, only their submission. His approach was to send his strong men to a country. While they were still far away, 50 miles, the country would already submit to him. Thus, he conquered the countries. The merchants of the country of wealth returned to their country and told about the mighty warrior described above. A great fear fell on the country. Even though they were willing to submit to him, they heard that he despised money and did not want it at all. Since this was opposite to their belief, they could not bring themselves to submit to him. To them, this would be like apostasy, because he did not believe in their faith, that is, in money. They were very frightened of him. They started to worship and offer sacrifices to their gods. They took animals, people with little money who were labeled animals, and offered them to their gods and other similar services. The warrior was drawing closer to them all the time, and he started to send his strong men to give them the choices, as was his custom. They became very afraid, not knowing what to do. The merchants among them advised them and told them that they had been in a country where everyone was a god who traveled in a carriage drawn by angels. That is, all of the citizens, from small to great, were all tremendously rich, until even the smallest among them was considered a god, according to their flawed thinking, for even the smallest among them had enough money, according to the standard the standards to be classified as God. And their carriages were drawn by angels, for their horses were adorned with abundant wealth, with gold and the like, until the raiment of one horse was worth the value of one of their angels. Thus, it could be said that they traveled with angels. They would harness 3 pairs of angels to a carriage and ride with them. Thus, it would be well to send for help from that country, and they would certainly receive help, since all the citizens of that country were gods. All this was the advice of the merchants to their fellow citizens. They were very satisfied with this, for they believed that certainly they would have salvation from that country, for everyone there was a god. Then the master of prayer decided to go back to that country. Perhaps he could still bring them back from their crooked ways. He went there and approached a guard, and began speaking with him in his usual fashion. The guard told him about the above-mentioned warrior, and that they were all very frightened of him. The master of prayer asked him, "What do your people intend to do about it?" The guard then told him of their intent to send for help from the country where everyone was a god. The master of prayer laughed heartily, saying, "It's all a lot of nonsense. The people of that country are also only human beings like us. You and all your gods are really only humans and not gods. There is one in the world, and that is the Creator. He is the only one whom it is appropriate to serve, and only to him is it appropriate to pray, and this is the main purpose." He spoke words along these lines to the guard, but the guard did not listen to him, for they had already been sunken in their mistaken beliefs for a long time. Nonetheless, the master of prayer continued speaking to him for a long time, until in the end the guard answered him, "But what can I do? I am only one individual, and opposing me is the entire population of the country." This answer was somewhat of a comfort to the master of prayer, for he saw that his words had at least some influence on the guard. The words he had spoken the first time to the guard, and the words he had said this time, had started to make an impression in his heart. He began to have doubts, and became a bit more willing to listen, as was evident from his reply. The master of prayer went and spoke to the second guard, and spoke with him in the same way. At first he did not listen, but in the end he answered, "But I am only one against the whole country, as the other one had." In the end, all the guards gave this answer. After this, the master of prayer entered the city and began to talk with people in his usual manner, saying that they were all gravely mistaken, and that this was not the purpose at all. Rather, the purpose was only to be involved in Torah and prayer, etc. They did not listen to him at all, for they had all been sunken in their crookedness for a long time. They told him about the warrior and how they wanted to send for help from the country where everyone was a god. He laughed at them as well. He said to them that it was nonsense, that they were only human beings, etc. They cannot help you at all, for you are people, and they are people, and not gods at all. Yet there is one, blessed be his name, etc. As for the warrior, he said wonderingly, could this be the warrior, that one that he knew, the one that he knew? They did not understand the meaning of these last words. He went from one individual to another, talking to each one as above. As for the warrior, he said to each one as before, could this be the warrior? No one understood his intent. There was a great commotion in the city, since there was someone speaking such things, making a mockery of their faith, and saying that there was only one God, etc., and spoke about the warrior as described above. They realized that this was undoubtedly the master of prayer, for he was already a famous figure. They commanded to follow him and catch him, even though he changed himself all the time. That is, at times he would appear to be a merchant, at times a pauper, etc. However, they were well aware of this tactic of his. They commanded to track him and capture him. They followed him, caught him, and brought him to the ministers, who started to speak with him. He said the same thing to them, how all of them were gravely mistaken, that money is not the purpose at all, that there is one, the Creator, etc. And the people of that country, whom you believe are all gods, cannot help you at all, for they are only people, etc. They thought he was mad, for they were all so immersed in mistaken beliefs about money, to the point that people who spoke contrary to their mistaken beliefs was thought to be insane. They asked him, what is this that you keep saying about the warrior in a tone of wonderment? Could this be the warrior? He answered them, I was once with a certain king, and he lost one of his warriors. If this warrior is the same one, then I am acquainted with him. What is more, what you hold about the country where they are all gods, this is nonsense, for they cannot help you. In my opinion, if you depend on them, that will be your downfall. They asked him, how do you know this? He answered them, the king with whom I was had a hand, that is, He had a picture of a hand with 5 fingers and all the lines that are normally on a hand. This hand was in fact a map of the world, of all the worlds and everything that had been from the beginning of the world to the end, and what will be after that. It was all inscribed on the hand. Written on the hand was the map of every world with all its details, as would appear on a geographic map. There were names in the drawings, just as on a map. Next to every item, there is an identifying name, in order that one can know what each thing is. Here is a certain city, there is a certain river, etc. Similarly, within the drawing on the hand were names next to every item, in order to identify each item. The details of all the countries, cities, rivers, bridges, mountains, and other district entities were all inscribed on the hand, and next to every item was a title that this is such and that is such and such. Also, every person in the country and all their experiences were all written in the map. All the travel routes from one country to another and from place to place were inscribed, and because of that I knew how to enter this city, which as a rule is impossible for anyone to enter. So, if you want to send me to another city, I would know how to get there, all with the help of the hand. It was also written there how to travel from one world to another. There is a path and a route by which one can ascend from earth to heaven. Normally, it is impossible to ascend to the heavens because the route is not known, but on the hand was written the route from earth to heaven. All the paths from one world to another were inscribed there. Elijah, ascended to heaven using one route, and that route was written there. Similarly, Hanoch ascended to heaven by another route, and that was also written there. The routes between all the worlds were inscribed on the hand. Also written on the hand were all the details of what had been at the creation of the world, and what was there now, and what it would be in the future. For example, Sodom appeared as it had been when it was settled, before its overturning, the overturning itself, and the image of Sodom after the overturning. What was, what is, and what will be are all inscribed on the hand, on that same hand. I saw that that country of which you claim all the citizens are gods, and all those who come to it for help will all be disgraced and destroyed. All this the master of prayer said to them. This was all a wonder to them. They could sense words of truth, for it is known that on a map everything is displayed accurately, and they saw that his words were words of truth. It is known that one can connect two creases of the hand and make from them a letter. They understood that it would be impossible for him to have invented this from his imagination, and it was a great wonder to them. Then they asked him, "Where is this king? Perhaps he can show us a way to find money." He answered them, "You still only want money?" in a tone of disbelief. "Do not talk about money at all." They asked him, "Even so, where is this king?" He said, "I also do not know where he is, but I will tell you a story. There once was a king and a queen, and they had an only daughter. When she began to come of age, they found advisors to help decide who would be fitting to marry her. I was also among the advisors, for the king had a liking for me. I recommended that they give to her the warrior, being that he had done us several favors, conquering several countries, and it was fitting to give him the princess for a bride. My advice was well received, and everyone agreed. There was great rejoicing that a match had been found for the princess. They married her to the warrior, and she gave birth to a child. This child was very, very beautiful, entirely beyond mortal beauty. Its hair was of gold, with all the colors of the spectrum. Its face was like the sun, and the eyes had their own radiance. This child was born with complete wisdom. They saw at the moment of his birth that he was completely wise. When people were talking at a point where it was appropriate to laugh, he would laugh, and so on. They perceived that he was extremely wise, only that he did not yet have the physical capability of an adult, such as speech and the like. The king had an orator, that is, a speaker and master of language, who could speak and recite very wondrous words, songs, and praises to the king. He was a skilled and pleasing speaker on his own, but the king showed him how to acquire even more the wisdom of oration, and through this he became a very awesome speaker. The king also had a wise man. He was wise to begin with, but the king showed him how to acquire more wisdom, and through this he became exceptionally wise. Similarly, the warrior had been a warrior to begin with, but the king showed him how to acquire more might, and through this he became a wondrous and awesome warrior. Now there is a sword that is suspended in midair, and it has three powers. When one rises it, all the officers of the armies flee, and this causes an immediate defeat. When the officers leave, there is no one to lead the battle, and they cannot wage war. It is still possible for the survivors to continue the fight. However, this sword has two edges, and they have two powers. Through one edge, everyone falls, and through the second, they become emaciated, and their flesh melts, as it known with this sickness, simply by the inflection with which the sword is swung. The according result befalls the enemies. Each edge according to its unique power. The king showed the warrior the way to this sword, and from that he received his great might, and I as well. The king showed me the way to my mission, and I received from there what I needed. The king had a faithful friend who loved him with a very passionate and awesome love, so that it was unbearable for them to be apart even a short time. Nonetheless, there are times when it is necessary to be separated. They had portraits of each other, and they would take delight in the portraits in the times when they were apart. The portraits illustrated how much the king and the friend loved each other, showing how they hugged and kissed each other with great love. The portraits had the power that anyone who looked at them would be filled with an intense love. That is, the quality of love would come to one who looked at the portraits. The friend also received his love from the place that the king showed him. The time came for each one to ascend to the place where he would receive his power. The orator, the warrior, and all the other of the king's people, each one ascended to the place where he renewed his strength. One day, there was a violent storm in the world. The storm overturned the whole world. Ocean became dry land, and land became ocean. Wilderness became civilization, and civilization became wilderness. The whole world was overturned. The storm came into the palace of the king, but did not do any damage. It only entered and snatched away the child of the princess. In the midst of the upheaval ensuing after the sweeping of the child, the princess ran after it. The queen and then the king also followed, until everyone was dispersed and no one knew where they were. We were not there during all this, for we had all ascended, each one to his place, to renew his power. When we returned, We could not find them. The hand was also missing, and since then, all of us have become dispersed. Since then, none of us have been able to ascend to our place to renew our strength, since the whole world had been overturned, and all the places of the world have been switched, sea to dry land, etc. It is certainly impossible to ascend through the first routes. Now one needs a new route according to the exchanges and shifting of places. Thus, none of us is able to ascend to his place to renew his strength. Nevertheless, the impression that remains with each of us is also very strong, and if this warrior you have described is the warrior of the king, he is certainly very powerful. All this the master of prayer said to the people of the country of wealth. When they heard his words, they were awestruck. They held on to the master of prayer, not letting him leave them, for perhaps the warrior who was coming toward them was the above-mentioned warrior, with whom the master of prayer was acquainted. The warrior drew nearer, and periodically sent messengers. Finally he arrived and stood outside the city. He sent in messengers, and the people were very frightened. They asked the master of prayer for advice. He said that they would need to scrutinize the way and behavior of the warrior in order to determine whether he was that same warrior, the warrior of the king. The master of prayer went out to meet the warrior. He came to the warrior's camp. He began to speak with one of the warrior's strong men, that is, one of the guards, to determine if he was the warrior of the king. He asked the guard, "What is your occupation, and how did you join with this warrior?" The guard answered him, "Here is the story. There is an account in our historical records of a violent storm that came to the world, and it overturned the whole world. It transformed sea to dry land, and dry land to sea, and wilderness to civilization, etc. After the commotion and noise died down, the people of the world began to consider who should be the king. They investigated to know who would be fitting to become their king. They said, being that the main thing is the purpose, therefore the one who strives the most to fulfill the purpose should be the king. Then they began to investigate what was the purpose, and they split into many groups. One group said that the main purpose was honor. They observed that honor was the most valued thing in the world. When a man is not given his honor, for example, when they say something against his honor, it is as if they spilled his blood, because honor is the main thing for all people. Even after a man's death, they are strict to give the deceased honor, to bury him respectfully, and so on. And they say to the deceased that all of what they are doing it for his honor, even though after death money and desires are not at all relevant to the deceased. They are very careful to honor the dead. Therefore, honor is the main purpose. They had other similar foolish reasoning. All the groups had much reasoning backing their flawed and misguided beliefs. Some of them are described below. However, Rabbi Nachman did not want to detail all the flawed reasoning of these beliefs. Some of them are so twisted that it is possible, God forbid, to truly be led astray by these false beliefs. May God have mercy. So they agreed that the purpose was honor. Thus, they needed to search for an honored man, and one who pursues honor, that is, one who pursues it and reaches it, so that he is honored. Since he is an honored man, who has honor, pursues honor, and gives support to the worldwide will to honor. Therefore, such a man strives toward the purpose and achieves it. All this was their foolish and confused reasoning. Thus, such a man is fit to be king. They went looking for such a man, and found people carrying an old beggar. Approximately 500 were following him, all gypsies, and he also was a gypsy. This beggar was blind, stooped over and dumb. But the people followed him, for all of them were of his family. He had so many brothers and sisters and children that they became a congregation, and they carried him along. He was very strict about his honor, for he was ill-tempered and became wroth with them all the time, with all kinds of complaints. He commanded all the time that different bearers carry him, and was angered all the time. Thus, this beggar is a very honored man, they thought. Since he has achieved such honor, he also pursues honor, for he is so strict about his honor. Thus, the beggar found favor with this group, and they accepted him as a king. But land also has influence, meaning that some lands are more favorable to honor, and other lands are supportive of other traits. Thus, this group that decided that honor was the purpose looked for a land supportive of honor, and found a suitable land and dwelt there. Another group held that honor was not the purpose, believing instead that the purpose was murder. We see that all things in the world eventually wither and pass away, and all that is in the world, grasses, plants, people, and all that is in the world, must all come to an end and pass on. Therefore, the purpose of everything is its termination. Thus, the murderer who kills and terminates people is very active in bringing the world to its purpose. Thus, they agreed among themselves that the purpose is murder. They looked for the most murderous, evil-tempered, and jealous man they could find, for such a man is closer to the purpose, according to their warped understanding, and is fitting to be king. They went searching and heard the sound of a scream. They asked, "What is that screaming sound?" They answered them, "That sound came from a man having slaughtered his father and mother." They then reflected, "Can there be a more ruthless and ill-tempered murderer than one who would kill his father and mother? This man has reached the purpose. He found favor in their eyes, and they accepted him as king. They searched for a land that was supportive of murder, and chose a place of mountains and hills, the kind of place where murderers tend to live, and went there and dwelt there with their king." Another group said that someone with an abundance of food was most fit to be king, one who ate food more refined than other people, milk, for example, in order that his intellect not become coarse. He would be fitting to rule. However, since they did not immediately find someone whose diet other than the norm, they temporarily chose a wealthy man who had an abundance of food, until they could find someone more ideally fitting their qualifications. At that time, the wealthy man would abdicate the throne. They accepted this wealthy man as king and chose a land supportive of their purpose and settled there. Another group said that someone beautiful was most fitting to rule. The main purpose is to settle the world, because for this the world was created. And since a beautiful woman arouses the desire to settle the world, it follows that she brings it to its purpose. Thus a beautiful woman was fitting to rule. They chose a beautiful woman and anointed her as their queen, and they looked for a land supportive of this and settled there. Another group said that the primary purpose was speech. What distinguishes man from animals is that he can speak, since that is the primary advantage man possesses. That must be the main purpose. They chose for themselves an orator, a master of languages who knew several and constantly babbled with speech. Such a person is reaching the purpose. They went and found a crazy Frenchman who went about talking to himself. They asked him if he knew languages, and he replied that he knew several. A person like this was certainly close to the purpose, according to their confused thinking. For he was a master of language, spoke many tongues, and talked so very much, for he talked even to himself. Thus, he found favor in their eyes, and they accepted him as king. They chose a land supportive of their idea and settled there with their king. He certainly ruled them with uprightness. Another group said that the main purpose was happiness. When a son is born, people are happy. When there is a wedding, they are happy. When they conquer a country, they are happy. Thus, the purpose of everything is happiness. They searched for a man who was always happy, thus being close to the purpose, and he would be their king. They went and found a shabby-looking person in a tattered garment, carrying a bottle of liquor, with several other lowlifes following him. This man was very happy, for he was very drunk. They saw his great happiness, and that he had no worries. He found favor in their eyes, for he had reached the purpose, which was happiness. They accepted him as their king, and he certainly ruled them uprightly. They chose a land suitable to their way, that is, vineyards and the like, where wine was made, and the dross was made into liquor. They would not let anything go to waste, for this was the main purpose for them: to drink, become drunk, and be constantly happy, even though there was no reason or sense in their happiness, for they did not have anything to be happy about. Even so, this was their main purpose: to be constantly happy for no reason. They chose a land supportive of this and settled there. Another group said the main purpose was wisdom. They looked for a master of wisdom and made him king over them. They searched out a land supportive of wisdom and settled there. Another group said the main purpose was to give attention to one's eating and drinking in order to strengthen the body. They looked for a muscular man with large limbs that he exercised to strengthen. One with larger limbs has a greater portion in the world, for he takes up more space, and he is closer to the purpose, for enlarging the limbs is the purpose. Such a man is fitting to rule. They went and found a very tall man, a giant. He found favor in their eyes, for he was so large and thus close to the purpose, and they made him their king. They looked for a land supportive of this and settled there. Finally, there was a group that said that none of these was the purpose. The true purpose was only to be involved with praying to God and to be humble and lowly. They looked for a master of prayer and made him their king. The reader can understand for himself that all the groups erred severely and deeply in entangled structures of thought. Only this last group came upon the truth. Happy are they. All this was related to the master of prayer by one of the mighty warriors. Then he told him that they, the warriors who banded with the above warrior, were from the group of the bodybuilders. who accepted upon themselves the giant man as their king. Now, one day, a band of them set out with wagons following them, carrying food and other supplies. These warriors cast fear upon everyone, for they were of giant proportions and mighty, and anyone who passed them swerved to the other side of the road. During their journey, they came across a particular warrior, the one who was now their leader. When this warrior came toward their caravan, he did not swerve to the side. Instead, he rode straight into the caravan and scattered them to all sides. The members of the band were frightened by him. He entered the wagons following the group and ate everything inside them. It was very awesome in their eyes, his great might, and that he was not intimidated by the caravan at all, entering it and eating everything in the caravans. They immediately prostrated themselves before him, saying, "Long live the king." They knew that a warrior such as this was surely fitting to rule, according to their opinion that the main purpose was to have large limbs. Certainly the former king would give over the kingdom to a warrior of such massive proportions, for he was most fitting to rule. Thus it was that this mighty one was accepted by them as king, and he is the same one who is leading us now in campaign to conquer the world. He says, that is, the warrior who had now become their king, that he has another intention in conquering the world. He is not really interested in the world being subjected to him, for he has a different intention altogether. All these are the words of one of the warriors who told all this to the master of prayer, who had asked him how they had banded with the warrior, and he answered all this. Then the master of prayer asked, "What is the greatness of this warrior who is your king?" The other answered, "There was one country which did not want to submit itself to him. So this warrior took his sword. Now, his sword has 3 powers. When it is raised, all the military officers flee, etc. These are the 3 powers mentioned above." When the master of prayer heard this, he knew that this must certainly be the warrior from the court of the king. He asked if it would be possible to meet in person with their leader. They answered that they would relay the request to the warrior and ask his permission. They went and asked, and he gave permission. When the master of prayer came to the warrior and recognized each other, they were tremendously happy that they had merited to come together. They rejoiced and wept, for they remembered the king and his company, and cried about that. Thus there was weeping as well as rejoicing. Then they spoke together about how events had unfolded to bring them to this place. The warrior recounted that after the storm had dispersed, the court of the king returned from the place he had ascended to. He had ascended to renew his strength. When he found that the king and all his company were missing, he wandered off to wherever the road would take him. Along the way, he came across all the company. That is, he understood that he had been in the place where each one was. For example, he came to a place and understood that the king was definitely there. However, he could not search for or find him. He then came to another place and understood that the queen was there, but again could not find her. Likewise, he came to the places of all the company. Only your place I did not come to. The master of prayer said, I passed by all the places, including yours. I came to one place and saw the crown of the king, and understood that the king is definitely there, only that I could not find him. Likewise, I continued and came to a sea of blood, and understood that this sea was certainly created from the tears of the queen, which she cried because of all that had come upon us. I knew the queen was there, only I could not search for or find her. I went on and came to a sea of milk, and understood that that sea was made from the milk of the princess. She had lost her son, and the overflow of milk had burdened her. And from this was created the sea of milk. The princess was definitely here, only it was impossible to find her. I went further and saw the golden hairs of the baby scattered, but I did not take any of them. I understood that the baby was definitely here, but I could not find him. I went further and came to the sea of wine, and I knew that this sea had surely been made from the words of the orator, who had stood and said consoling words before the king and queen, and then turned to say more consolations to the princess. From these words was made the sea of wine, as it is written in Song of Songs 7, your mouth is like good wine. However, I could not find him. Thus I continued on, and saw a stone on which was carved a picture of the hand with all the elements mapped on it. I understood that the king's wise man was certainly here, and he had carved this likeness of the hand. However, it was impossible to find him, so I went further and saw arranged on a mountain the golden tables and treasure pieces and other valuables of the king. I understood that the treasurer must certainly be here, but I was unable to find him." The warrior replied, "I also passed all these places, and I took from the golden hair of the child. I took 7 hairs that included the full range of colors, and they are very precious to me. I sat in the place where I sat, and sustained myself to what extent I could, eating grasses and the like, until there remained nothing to eat, and then I went onward. When I left that place, I forgot my bow there. The master of prayer answered, I saw your bow, and I knew it was certainly yours, but I could not find you." Then the warrior continued his story. "When I left there, I went on until I came to a caravan and entered it. I was extremely hungry and wanted to eat. I immediately after entering, they accepted me as their king, and now I am campaigning to conquer the world, with the intention that perhaps I will find the king and his court." The master of prayer asked the warrior, "What can we do with these people?" That is, the people of the country that had fallen so deeply into the lust for money, until they arrived at this nonsense. To say that wealthy people are gods for them, and the rest of the foolishness of these people. The warrior answered that he had heard from the king that it was possible to retrieve someone who had fallen into all the passions. However, it was impossible by any means to save one who fell into this passion for money. So they certainly could not have an effect on the people of that country, for it would be impossible to bring them out of this condition, with one exception. He had heard from the king that along the way to the sword that had granted him his might, one could be retrieved from the passion for money into which he had sunk. The master of prayer and the warrior sat together some time. As for the request of these people, who had asked the master of prayer to go to the warrior on their behalf, the master of prayer convinced the warrior to give them more time, so he extended the time for them. The warrior and the master of prayer gave signs to one another so that they would know what was happening with each other, and the master of prayer went on his way. On his way, the master of prayer saw people going along and praying, and carrying compilations of prayers. He was frightened by them, and they were frightened by him. He stood to prayer, and they also prayed. Then he asked them, "Who are you?" They answered, "At the time of the storm, when all the peoples were scattered, and each type chose which goal to pursue, as was detailed above in the account of the groups of mankind. We chose to be involved constantly with prayer to God. We looked for and found a master of prayer, and made him our king. When the master of prayer heard this, he was very pleased, for this was also his desire. He started speaking with them and revealed the order of his prayers, his compilations, and other matters. When they heard his words, their eyes were opened, and they saw the greatness of his level, and immediately made him their king. Their present king handed over the kingdom to him, for he saw the awesome level which he had achieved. The master of prayer studied with them, enlightening them, and turned them into completely righteous and great men, even before they had been righteous, for they dealt only with prayer. However, the master of prayer enlightened them till they became very awesomely righteous. Then the master of prayer sent a letter to the warrior to inform him who he had merited to find such people, how he had merited to find such people, and that he had become their king. Meanwhile, the people of the country of wealth continued in their ways and religious service as described above. As the deadline that the warrior had set drew increasingly nearer, they became very afraid. They did their services, making offerings and incense and reciting their prayers directed to their gods. They agreed that it was mandatory to follow the first plan, to send to the country which was so immensely wealthy that everyone was a god. They would certainly save them, since they were all gods. So they sent messengers there. Along the way, they came across a man who walked with a cane, and this cane was more valuable than all their gods together. The cane was made of precious stones, and it was more valuable than all the other gods, either those of their own country, or even those to whom they were traveling. The cane surpassed all the wealth of all of them. He also wore a very valuable hat, in which were embedded precious stones. They immediately bowed and prostrated themselves before him. According to their understanding, he was a god above all their gods, being that he had such extravagant wealth. This man they had met was in fact the treasurer of the king. This man said to them, "Is this such a novelty for you? Come with me, and I will show you wealth." He led them to the mountain where lay all the treasures of the king, and he showed them the cash. The cash. They immediately fell prostrate before him, for this was certainly a god beyond all others, according to their foolish and mistaken conceptions. But they did not make offerings there, even though, according to their view, he was a god beyond all others, and they would surely have been ready to offer themselves to him. However, When they had been sent on their mission, they had been warned not to make any offerings. Those who sent them feared that if they made offerings, they would be wiped out. Perhaps they would find some treasure along the way. For example, if one went to an outhouse and found a treasure there and believed it to be a god, they might all begin to offer themselves to it, and none of them would be left. Therefore, those sending them warned them not to make any offerings on the way. Therefore, the messengers did not offer any sacrifices to the treasurer. Yet it was clear to them that he was a god above all others, being that he possessed such incredible wealth. Then the messengers considered to themselves, "Why should we go all the way to the country where everyone is a god? This man can certainly save us, for he is a god greater than all the others, since he has such immense, incredible wealth, far exceeding all the others." Thus, they asked the man to return with them to their country, and he agreed to go with them. They reached their country, and all the citizens were ecstatically happy that they had found a god such as this. They were certain that with his help they would be fully redeemed, being that he was such a god with such great wealth. Now this man, the treasurer of the king, who this country had accepted as king, commanded that until a new order was established, they should not offer sacrifices at all. In truth, the treasurer was a very saintly man, for he was from the court of the king, and all of them were great spiritual masters. Certainly, he was disgusted with all the perverse costumes and nonsense of these people. However, he could not as yet bring them back from their evil ways, so he commanded them in the meantime to suspend the offerings. The people of the country began to inquire about the warrior who was threatening them. The treasurer also said, "Could this be the warrior?" Then he went out to the warrior and asked the guards if he could be permitted to see him. They said they would go and ask him. They asked. He gave permission, and the treasurer was brought in to see him. They recognized one another, and there was much joy and weeping, as before. The warrior said to the treasurer, "I also met with our fine master of prayer. He has already become a king." And they related to each other how they came to be here. The treasurer said that he had passed the place of the king and the others of his company. However, the place of two he had not passed, that of the master of prayer and of the warrior. Then they spoke together about that country, how they had erred and become so confused until they had come to believe such nonsense. The warrior gave the same answer to the treasurer as he had to the master of prayer. He had heard from the king that someone who had fallen into the lust for money could only be saved by the path that led to the sword, in which place the warrior had received his might. Through that, one could be saved. They extended the deadline further. That is, the treasurer convinced the warrior to give the people more time once again. He extended the deadline once again. Then the treasurer and the warrior gave signs to each other as before. The treasurer departed from the warrior and returned to the country of wealth. The treasurer certainly reproached them for their evil way, that they had become so immersed in the lust for money, but it did not help, for they were already far sunken in it. However, since they had already heard much reproach, both from the master of prayer and the treasurer, it confused them, and they began to say, "Please, retrieve us from our mistaken way," even though they were holding on to their beliefs stubbornly and had no desire to rectify them. They said to the ones reprimanding them, "If you are really sure that we are in such great confusion and error, then take us out of our mistake." The treasurer, being that he knew the power of the warrior, and from where he received his power, gave them this advice. He explained to them the matter of the sword from whence the warrior receives his strength. "Let us go together to the place of the sword," he said to them, "and with it you will be able to stand up to the warrior." His real intention in sending them was that through going there they would be able to overcome their lust for money. They accepted the advice to go with him to the place of the sword. The treasurer set out, and the people sent with him the officials of the state, who were as gods to them. The officials went bedecked in inexpensive jewelry of silver and gold, for that was the main priority for them. They all went together. The treasurer informed the warrior that he was going with people from the country to the place of the sword, and his intention was that perhaps along the way he would find the king and his court. The warrior answered him, "I will also go with you." The warrior disguised himself so the people of the country would not recognize him. Then they decided that they should tell the master of prayer. They did. he said that he would come as well. He went to meet them, telling his followers to pray for him, that God should grant them success in the undertaking, that they should find the king and his court. The master of prayer would always pray for this, but now, as he went to join the treasurer and the warrior to search for the king, he urged them especially to pray all the time that they should find them. The master of prayer came to the treasurer and the warrior, and there was much joy and happiness between them. The three of them went together along with the gods, that is, the wealthy and prominent figures of the country, who were regarded by the citizens as gods. They went on their way and came to one country. There were guards circling the whole country. They asked the guards about the matters of this country and who was its king. The guards answered that at the time of the storm, when the people of the world were divided into groups, these people had chosen wisdom as their goal. They accepted a great wise man as their king, and shortly after they found a very exceptionally wise man, and the first king handed over the kingdom to this one. He became king, for the priority for them was wisdom, and since this man was so amazingly wise, they made him king. Then the three mentioned above, the treasurer, the warrior, and the master of prayer, said, "It appears that this is our wise man, the wise man of the king." They asked if it would be possible to meet him in person, and the guards replied that they would relay their request and find out. They went and asked, and he gave permission. They came to the wise man, who was the king of that country, and they recognized each other. This wise man was the same wise man of the king. There was surely much joy then, joy and weeping, as before. They wept about how they would manage to find the king and his court. They asked the wise man if he knew the whereabouts of the hand of the king. He answered that the hand was with him. However, since the storm had dispersed everyone and the king had disappeared, he did not want to look at the hand, for it was appropriate only for the king to see. However, he carved a likeness of the hand on the stone in order to use it minimally for his objective, but he did not look upon the hand itself at all. They asked the wise man how he had come to be there. He related that since the time of the storm he had wandered, and during his wandering he had passed the place of them all, except the place of these three, the treasurer, the warrior, and the master of prayer, until the people of this country had found him and crowned him king. Now he needs to govern them according to their present condition, according to the way of their wisdom, until in the course of time he would draw them to the truth. Then they spoke with the wise men about the people of the country of wealth, who had erred and fallen so deeply in the nonsense and idol worship of money. They said, even if we had only been separated and dispersed for the sake of this one country, to bring them to the proper path, it would have been enough, for they had strayed and sunken so very far. In truth, all the groups had erred and strayed and were in need of repair, to bring them out of their folly and to bring them to the true purpose. Even the group that had chosen wisdom as the purpose had not reached the true purpose and needed repair and repentance, for they had chosen superficial wisdom and heretical thought. From all these various errors of the different groups, it was easier to bring this group back from their mistaken ways and lead them to the truth. But those that had sunken into the idol worship of money had fallen so far that it was impossible to bring them back. The wise man also recounted to his companions that he had heard from the king that the only way to save those who had fallen into the lust for money was by the path to the sword. The wise man also agreed to go with them, so the four of them went together, and those foolish gods continued following them as well. They went along and came to a country. They asked the guards about the nature of the country, and who was their king. They answered that since the time of the storm, they had decided that the purpose was speech. They chose for themselves an orator, a master of language, for their king. Later, they found a man who was a master of language and eloquence, a very awesome speaker, and they accepted him as king. The first king gave the kingdom over to him, being that he was such an accomplished speaker. The four realized that this was their orator, the orator of the king. They requested to see him in person as well. The guards said they would relay the message and find out. They went and asked, and he gave them permission. The four were brought into the presence of this king, and he was the orator of the king mentioned earlier. They recognized each other, and they had great joy and weeping. As before, the orator also joined with them, and they continued on in the hope of finding the king and his court. They saw that God was granting them success, in that every time they found another of their friends. They attributed this to the merit of their upright master of prayer, who was constantly praying for this, and through his prayers they merited to find their friends. They continued, hoping perhaps they would marry to find the rest as well. They went on and came to a country. Also there, they asked about the nature of the country and who was its king. They answered that they were the group that had chosen joy and drink as the purpose. They accepted as their king a drunken man who was always joyful. Later, they found a man who sat in a sea of wine, and this suited them better. He was certainly an unparalleled drunkard, so they accepted him as king. The companions requested also to meet in person with him, so the messengers went, secured permission, and they were brought to this king. He was the loyal friend of the king, who had been sitting in the sea of wine created by the consoling words of the orator, as described above. The citizens of that country assumed he was a great drunkard, as he was sitting in a sea of wine, and thus they made him king. They recognized each other, and once again there was great rejoicing and weeping. The loyal friend continued on with the others. They came to another country and asked the guards, "Who is your king?" They answered that their monarch was a beautiful woman, for such a person leads to the purpose which is the settling of the world, as explained above. At first they had a moderately beautiful woman for a queen. Then they found one with amazing and unsurpassed beauty, and they accepted her as queen. The band of friends understood that this was undoubtedly the princess mentioned earlier, so they requested to see her in person as well. Permission was secured. They entered her presence, and they recognized her as the princess. The intensity of their joy is impossible to imagine. They asked her how she had come to be there. She recounted to them that after the storm which had snatched away the precious child, she had gone out in the midst of the upheaval looking for the child, but did not find him. Meanwhile, the oversupply of milk was pressuring her, and that created the sea of milk. Afterwards, the citizens of this country had found her and made her their king. There was great rejoicing among them, but they also wept over the precious child which had been lost, and about his father and mother, whose whereabouts were not known. Then the husband of this queen, that is, the princess who had become here a queen, had come. The warrior was her husband. So now the country had a king. The princess then asked the master of prayer to come to her country and purify it from its deep defilement, since in that country the main purpose was physical beauty. They were certainly very defiled in this passion. Thus she asked the master of prayer, to go and purify them a bit for the time being, so that they should not become even more immersed in this passion. In addition to the power of the passion itself, they also believed that this was the purpose, for each group that had chosen some evil quality as the purpose had created a religion out of the quality. Thus, they were sunken deeply in this. The princess therefore asked that he go and purify them somewhat in the meantime. After this, they went looking for the rest, that is, the king, etc. They came to one country and asked, "Who is your king?" They answered that their king was 1 year old. They were a group that had decided that someone with an abundance of food, whose diet was not comparable to that of ordinary people, would be fitting to be king. Temporarily, they had accepted some wealthy man as king, but later they found a man who was sitting in a sea of milk, and this pleased them very much. This man had lived all his life on milk, and his diet was not like that of ordinary people, so they accepted him as king. Thus, they called him 1 year old, for his diet was that of a 1 year old. They realized that this was the child, and they asked to meet him in person. The request was sent and granted. They were brought into his presence, and they recognized each other. The child also recognized them, even though he had been very young when he had been separated from them. Nevertheless, because he was born with complete wisdom, he recognized them. They recognized him easily, and there was very awesome rejoicing. They also wept at still not knowing the whereabouts of the king and queen. They asked him, "How did you come to be here?" He answered that when the storm had come and taken him away to where it took him, he lived on whatever he could find, until he came to a sea of milk. He understood that this sea was undoubtedly made from the milk of his mother, and that the milk must have pressured her, and that was how this sea was formed. He sat upon that sea and was sustained by the milk until the people of this country had come and made him their king. After this, they continued and came to a country and asked, "Who is your king?" They answered that they had determined that murder was the purpose, and they accepted some murderer as their king. After that, they found a woman sitting in a sea of blood. They accepted her as king, since they assumed that she was certainly a big murderer, being that she was sitting in a sea of blood. They requested to see her as well. Permission was granted, and they were brought into her presence. This was the queen mentioned before, who had been crying constantly, and whose tears became the sea of blood. They recognized each other, and there was great rejoicing. Yet they also cried, for they still did not know the whereabouts of the king. They went further on, and came to a country, and asked, "Who is your king?" They answered that they had chosen an honorable man. For them, the main purpose was honor. After this, they found an old man wearing a crown and sitting in a field. He found favor in their eyes, for he was a very honored man, being that he sat in a field wearing a crown. They accepted him as king. The band of friends understood right away that this was certainly the king, their king, that is. They asked once again if they could meet with him in person, and permission was granted. They were brought in before him, and they recognized that this was the king himself. The joy they experienced was beyond the capacity of the mind to comprehend. The foolish gods, the wealthy, important people of the country of wealth, who were considered gods in their country, went along with them, but had no idea what was the cause of all this joy. Now all the holy court was gathered together again. They sent the master of prayer to the various countries, the countries of the group that had chosen bad traits as the purpose, to repair and purify them, to bring them back from their foolishness, each country according to its foolishness and mistaken way. All of them had erred and strayed, and now the master of prayer certainly had the power to bring them back, for he had received the permission of the kings of all the countries. For the holy gathering of the king, who had now been reunited, were all kings over the countries of the groups. The master of prayer went empowered by them to purify and bring all the countries to repentance. The warrior then spoke with the king about the people of the country that had fallen into the idol worship of money. He said to the king, "I heard you quoted that through the path that I take to reach the sword, one can bring back those who are sunken in the idol worship of money." The king answered that it was so. He informed the warrior that along the path to the sword there is a path to the side that leads to a mountain of fire. On this mountain crouches a lion. When he needs to eat, he goes and attacks the flocks and eats sheep and other animals. The shepherds know about him, so they guard their flocks very carefully against him. But the lion pays no heed to them, and when he wants to eat, he preys on the flocks. The shepherds swing their clubs at him and make a great din, but the lion pays no attention. He helps himself to the sheep and the other beasts, roars and eats them. This mountain of fire is completely invisible. Along the way there is also another path. It leads to a kitchen, and in that kitchen are many varieties of food. There is no fire in the kitchen at all. Rather, all the foods are cooked by the fire on the mountain. The mountain of fire is far from there, but there are conduits running from the mountain to the kitchen, and through this all the foods are cooked. The kitchen is also invisible. There is only an indication. Birds gather at the location, and only through that is it possible to locate the kitchen. Those birds flap their wings, and so they heat up or cool off the foods. That is, their flapping either increases or diminishes the fire, so that it will burn at the needed intensity according to the food being cooked. For one food, they fuel the fire to one extent, and for another food to another extent, all depending upon the food being cooked. All these were the words of the king to the warrior. Thus, take them, the gods of the country of wealth, who had accompanied them, against the direction of the wind, in order that the odors of the foods of the kitchen reach them. After that, when you give them to eat from the foods, they will certainly abandon their lust for money. The warrior took the high-standing people of the country of wealth, who were gods in their country. They had been here the whole time before, for they had come with the treasurer, as was described above. When they had left their country with the treasurer, the people of the country had empowered them, so that whatever they would do would be accepted. All the citizens would be obliged to abide by whatever they did, for they were considered as gods by the country. There would be no possibility of doing differently. The warrior took these people, who were called gods in their country by virtue of their wealth, and led them along the path all the way to the kitchen. First, he led them against the wind, so that the odors of the foods reached them, and they began to beg the warrior to give them from these foods to eat. Then he led them away from the wind, and they cried out that there was a terrible stench. Then he led them again against the wind, and again the odor of the foods reached them, and once again they begged him that he give them from those foods. Then he led again away from the wind, and they began to smell the stench again, and cried out in response to it. The warrior said to them, "You can see that there is nothing in the area to cause this stench you smell. It must be coming from you, for there is nothing else here to cause such smell." Then the warrior gave them to eat from the foods. As soon as they ate from them, they immediately began to cast away all their silver and gold. Each one dug a pit for himself and buried himself in it out of his great shame, feeling terribly embarrassed. Having tasted of the foods from the kitchen, they sensed the disgusting quality of their money, for it truly smelled like excrement. They tore at their faces and buried themselves, and could not raise their heads at all. They were embarrassed before each other. Now, having money was the greatest embarrassment. Someone who wanted to insult his friend would say that he had a lot of money. Now, money was a great source of shame, and everyone who had more money was more ashamed. Thus, they buried themselves out of their extreme shame, and no one could raise their head, even before his friend. All the more so before the warrior. Anyone who still found in his possession some coin would rid himself of it, casting it far away with great haste. Then the warrior came to them and extracted them from their pits, saying, "Come with me. Now you do not need to be afraid of the warrior." For all the people of the country had been afraid of him, as recounted before. "I am that warrior." Then they asked the warrior to give them more of the food, to take it back to their country. They themselves already abhorred money, but they wanted to save the rest of their people from it as well. He gave them of the foods, and they took it to their country. Immediately upon being given the foods, the people cast away their silver and gold, and buried themselves in pits of dirt out of their intense shame. The very wealthy ones and the gods were the most ashamed. Even the poorer ones, who were referred to as wild animals, were also embarrassed at having considered themselves lowly because of their poverty. Now it had been revealed that money was the greatest embarrassment. Those foods had the quality that one who ate from them abhorred money, and would sense the full stench of it, like excrement and waste material. Thus, they cast away their idols of silver and gold. After that, the master of prayer was sent to them, and he gave them ways of repentance and repair, and purified them. The king ruled the entire earth, and the whole world returned to God, devoting themselves only to Torah, prayer, repentance, and good deeds. Amen. May it be His will. Blessed is Hashem forever. Amen and Amen. Note: the story has its basis in the book of Isaiah, Yeshayahu, chapter 31. It is described there that God has an oven in one place and a fire in another place, far from the oven. As it is written, "Thus says the Lord, whose fire is in Zion, and whose oven is in Jerusalem." From the same chapter, woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and depend on their horses. Egypt is a man, and not a god, and their horses are flesh, and not spirit. This alludes to the country that depended on the country where all were gods, believing they would save them. The belief that they were all gods and their horses were angels was all delusion, as is recounted in the story. On that day, every man will be repulsed by his idols of silver and gold, Ibidem. This refers to when the people, sunken in lust for money, were brought to the oven, smelled the foods, and became disgusted by their money. Look and perceive that the entire story is discussed in this chapter of the book of Isaiah, Yeshayahu. Rabbi Nachman said explicitly that the whole story from beginning to end is hinted at in that chapter. There are other passages from other places in scripture that also relate to the story, but the story is primarily based on the above mentioned chapter. These things are still very hidden, for the inner depth of the story he did not reveal at all. He only brought our attention to these scriptural passages so that we should know that there are very deep and awesome secrets embedded in the stories. Happy is he who merits to understand a little from these secrets in these stories.